Two Allied armies walked into the exact same jungle, but only one vanished into it. In the steaming claustrophobia of Puak Tui, visibility was measured in inches, but death was measured in decibels. The canopy above was so thick that noon felt like dusk, filtering sunlight into a hazy green twilight. This was a theater where the environment itself fought against every soldier who entered, demanding absolute submission to its suffocating atmospheric pressure before a single rifle shot was ever fired in anger. The physical toll of the terrain was immediate. Temperatures regularly hovered around 40 degrees Celsius, compounded by a staggering 90% humidity that turned the air into a heavy, breathable liquid. Under the dense canopy, sound carried unpredictably, distorted by endless layers of vegetation. Certain noises were inexplicably amplified, bouncing off slick leaves, while others were swallowed entirely by the damp earth. The wet season transformed the ground into a treacherous quagmire that gripped combat boots, ensuring exhaustion arrived long before combat. Moving through a dense stand of razor-sharp bamboo is an Australian reconnaissance patrol. There are 4 men, moving with painstaking deliberation. Their silhouettes blur seamlessly into the surrounding greens and browns, an intentional camouflage enhanced by their distinctive fabric bush hats pulled low. They step carefully, reading the jungle floor like a complex topographical map they have studied for years. Every muscle movement is calculated to minimize dangerous friction with the surrounding environment. You can hear the relentless drone of insects, the distant calls of unseen birds, and the subtle rustle of leaves shifting in a faint breeze. But the Australians themselves remain essentially ghosts within the tangled undergrowth. A seasoned sergeant silently signals a halt with a mere flick of his wrist. He breathes softly, listening intently to the jungle's baseline rhythm. If they need to communicate, it is through practiced hand signals or whispers so low they barely disturb the humid air. Barely 3 kilometers away, an American infantry patrol pushes heavily through the exact same unforgiving terrain. Their steel helmets catch the filtered light penetrating the canopy. Metal clips, canteens, and buckles create an undeniable rhythm of small mechanical sounds. It is a steady sequence of taps, clinks, and the harsh brush of heavy canvas grinding against more canvas. They move with undeniable purpose, backed by the immense logistical weight of a superpower. Yet, they are highly visible and dangerously audible. The underlying question here is not about which specific tactical approach required more personal bravery. Both armed forces fought with extraordinary, documented courage throughout the brutal duration of the conflict. The fundamental question is significantly more complex regarding applied military science. Why did 2 highly trained, closely allied armies, fighting the exact same adversary in identical conditions, present such radically different footprints? The answer lies strictly within the rigid institutional doctrines dictating tropical warfare. For the American infantrymen, doctrine mandated a massive physical burden. The average soldier humped between 60 to 80 pounds of essential gear through the stifling heat. This staggering load included extra ammunition, combat rations, heavy radio equipment, fragmentation grenades, and vital medical supplies. This immense weight fundamentally altered their biomechanics, forcing a heavier, louder footfall deep into the muddy earth. Every single snag of a sharp vine against metal generated acoustic friction, creating extreme tactical vulnerability. This heavy configuration was an entirely deliberate calculation. American military doctrine was firmly built upon the historical expectation of making decisive contact, then immediately summoning overwhelming firepower. When the shooting inevitably started, those soldiers needed to physically sustain themselves until artillery or aerial support could obliterate the enemy. They patrolled with the inherent expectation of intense violence, moving in larger elements to ensure maximum defensive capability. Their armor prioritized blunt survivability during ambushes. Conversely, the Australian tactical mindset viewed the dark jungle not merely as an obstacle, but as a vital tactical partner. Their primary mission was aggressive stealth. Small teams slipped deep into contested territory, remaining completely isolated for days to gather precise intelligence. Their operational success depended entirely on avoiding unwanted detection. Every single item of equipment was mercilessly evaluated against its acoustic footprint. If a piece of standard gear jingled or reflected ambient light, it was ruthlessly left behind. The brutal reality of the environment punished both specific approaches without mercy. Moving through dense vines and suffocating heat drained the human body of salt and water at an alarming, dangerous rate. An American soldier expended massive caloric energy just fighting the heavy vegetation for every miserable yard gained. Meanwhile, an Australian soldier expended immense psychological energy, maintaining the agonizingly slow, perfectly silent pace required to remain effectively undetected. Both methods tested strict physiological limits. Sound in this hostile environment was incredibly deceptive. A violently snapped twig could mimic a rifle shot, while the movement of a full platoon could be completely masked by the sudden, violent downpour of a monsoon storm. The dense flora created strange acoustic dead zones and unpredictable amplification pockets. A whispered command might carry 50 meters linearly, yet remain completely inaudible to friendly units standing 10 meters directly to the immediate flank. Both modern armies were essentially walking directly into a massive, humid snare. But they explicitly wore completely different armor for the trial. The Americans utilized thick steel, aggressively preparing for the inevitable blast of a chaotic ambush. The Australians utilized soft fabric, systematically hoping to avoid the bloody ambush entirely through strict invisibility. To truly understand the profound, lethal friction of jungle warfare, one must carefully examine their respective, highly specialized combat headgear. The American M1 steel helmet was an engineering marvel of the Second World War. Designed specifically to deflect flying shrapnel and deadly debris. However, in the steaming depths of the Vietnamese jungle, the physics of survival drastically shifted. Weighing over 3 pounds, this heavy steel dome essentially became a localized heat trap pressing relentlessly against a soldier's skull. During an exhaustive 12-hour patrol in 90% humidity, the constant downward pressure triggered severe neck fatigue, forcing an unnatural posture that subtly degraded a man's situational awareness and physical endurance over time. A steel helmet in a monsoon was essentially a percussive bell strapped to a soldier's skull. Survival here didn't favor the thickest armor. It favored the absolute absence of friction. When torrential rains fell, water relentlessly drummed against the hard metal shell, creating a localized, deafening roar for the wearer. This constant pinging noise completely obliterated a squad's ability to hear incoming threats. Furthermore, the metallic acoustics broadcasted their exact coordinates to any hidden enemy combatants listening patiently within a 100-meter radius of their muddy patrol route. The mechanics of the heavy helmet created compounding tactical dilemmas. To maintain comfort, many soldiers completely unfastened the rigid chin straps, fearing the deadly concussive snap of an explosive blast catching the brim and breaking their necks. Yet, a loose strap meant the 3-pound steel pot constantly shifted with every heavy footstep. This continuous microscopic movement generated a distinct rhythm of dull metallic thuds against the inner liner. In an environment where acute auditory perception was paramount, fighting your own protective equipment became a fatal distraction for tired infantrymen. Visually, the human head remains one of the most recognizable, geometric shapes in the natural world. The smooth, perfectly symmetrical curves of the M1 helmet only serve to aggressively highlight this distinct silhouette against the chaotic, irregular backdrop of tangled vines. Even covered with a matte fabric cover, the hard, rounded edges occasionally caught unnatural glimpses of filtered sunlight. In a dense environment where spotting a target a split second earlier determined who lived or died, broadcasting a perfectly rounded shadow was a catastrophic visual liability for moving troops. Conversely, the Australian military deployed with a piece of equipment explicitly refined by decades of tropical suffering, the wide-brimmed fabric bush hat. Weighing mere ounces, it fundamentally altered how a soldier interacted physically with the oppressive environment. The irregular, sloped brim naturally disrupted the recognizable dome of the human skull, casting uneven, disruptive shadows across the face. From a distance of 30 meters through thick bamboo, the wearer effectively ceased to look like a man, dissolving organically into the chaotic geometry of the surrounding jungle undergrowth. Beyond mere visual camouflage, The soft fabric possessed critical moisture management properties that directly impacted combat effectiveness. Under the suffocating canopy, sweat pouring into a soldier's eyes did not merely sting. It temporarily blinded them precisely when they needed to spot hidden tripwires. The bush hat's absorbent inner band efficiently channeled this debilitating moisture away from the visual plane. Veterans later noted that staying clear-eyed and focused during a grueling midday patrol was infinitely more valuable than thick armor when detecting a camouflaged bunker complex hidden ahead. The most crucial anatomical advantage, however, was strictly auditory. A helmet forms an acoustic barrier tight against the skull, actively muffling ambient frequencies and severely distorting directional perception. The Australian bush hat sat loosely, allowing unimpeded air circulation and, critically, unfiltered sound processing. Soldiers could accurately track the subtle snap of a dry branch or precisely locate a whispering voice in the thick brush. The wide brim actually functioned to cup and funnel horizontal sound waves directly into the ears, enhancing natural acoustic detection against creeping adversaries. Moving silently through wait-a-minute vines and thorny brush required a sensory connection to the immediate physical space. The flexible brim of the bush hat acted as an extended tactile sensor. It would softly catch on invisible spider webs or brush against low-hanging branches fractions of a second before the wearer's face impacted them. This minute physical feedback allowed an experienced tracker to instinctively freeze, smoothly duck, and systematically adjust their precise movement without snapping a single leaf or telegraphing their slow advance through the dense thicket. When a soldier wearing a helmet collided with a low branch, the resulting metallic scrape was violently unnatural. The Australian approach demanded strict acoustic discipline. If a branch hits your fabric hat, it sounds exactly like a leaf hitting another leaf. A seasoned SASR sergeant would quietly instruct his new recruits during rigorous field training. This embedded philosophy dictated that natural friction was acceptable, but artificial friction was deadly. A soft hat smoothly sliding past rough tree bark generated zero mechanical resonance, maintaining the illusion of an undisturbed forest. During the violent monsoon season, the fabric headgear demonstrated another distinct auditory advantage. Heavy raindrops striking the soft, water-resistant canvas created a low, organic patter that harmonized with the natural ambient noise of the soaking jungle. This allowed the Australian patrols to maintain their critical horizontal hearing while the storm raged around them. They could still listen effectively for the unmistakable sound of mud sucking at an enemy's sandal, maintaining a distinct tactical edge even as the weather actively tried to drown out all surrounding environmental awareness. Ultimately, the helmet forced a soldier to constantly fight a defensive battle against his own immediate surroundings. An infantryman had to consciously duck lower, move slightly wider, and contort his tired body specifically to protect his bulky headgear from snagging on the aggressive flora. This constant micromanagement of equipment rapidly accelerated muscular fatigue. The Australian trooper, unburdened by rigid steel, moved smoothly and organically, his neck completely free to swivel instantly toward any suspicious shadow or sudden acoustic anomaly lurking just beyond the thick foliage. The strict physics of jungle survival dictated an agonizing series of tactical compromises. Ballistic defense inherently required adding unnatural weight and rigid geometry to the fragile human frame. Stealth inherently required stripping away that protective armor to achieve total environmental synchronization. The Australians calculated that the best method to survive a fragmentation grenade was to never be detected by the man throwing it. Their lightweight, silent fabric hat was the physical manifestation of a doctrine that aggressively traded blunt force survivability for absolute, terrifyingly effective acoustic invisibility. The American machine treated the enemy as the primary obstacle to be eradicated. The Australian patrol treated the jungle as the apex predator to be respected. This fundamental divergence in military philosophy did not emerge spontaneously in the humid valleys of Phuoc Tuy. It was the direct result of deeply ingrained institutional memory. Both Allied armies carried the heavy ghosts of their previous conflicts into Vietnam, deploying tactical frameworks that had historically guaranteed their survival. Equipment choices, including the seemingly simple selection of headgear, were merely the visible manifestations of these overarching strategic doctrines interacting with a totally alien environment. The United States military arrived in Southeast Asia carrying the victorious legacy of the Second World War and the bitter conventional stalemate of the Korean Peninsula. Their institutional doctrine was built upon the absolute supremacy of massed firepower, superior industrial logistics, and decisive, large-scale engagements. Success historically came from physically dominating the terrain and destroying the adversary through sheer mechanical force. This operational mindset inherently required heavy logistical trains and heavily armored soldiers. When an American infantry platoon walked into the jungle, they walked as a heavily fortified mobile base, fully expecting to absorb the initial blow of an ambush. Every piece of standard American equipment, including the heavy steel M1 helmet, was engineered specifically for this aggressive methodology of sustained combat. The tactical assumption was never about completely avoiding the fight. It was about surviving the opening volley of lead and shrapnel. Once contact was inevitably established, the heavily laden infantrymen were trained to immediately establish a firm defensive perimeter. They would then use their advanced radio networks to call down a devastating storm of heavy artillery and coordinated close air support. Their gear was explicitly designed to keep them alive just long enough for that overwhelming firepower to arrive. Conversely, the Australian military deployed to Vietnam with a completely different institutional pedigree, forged in the suffocating tropical canopies of the Pacific Theater and the subsequent Malayan emergency. British and Australian forces had spent years ruthlessly hunting communist insurgents through impenetrable rainforests. During these grueling campaigns, they learned that large, heavily armed formations were fundamentally useless against a phantom enemy. Heavy equipment merely exhausted the troops and loudly broadcasted their impending arrival. In Malaya, the undeniable lesson was that the unforgiving jungle environment actively rewarded patient adaptation and severely punished rigid, conventional military thinking. Australian doctrine in Vietnam directly reflected this hard-won tropical expertise. Their operational emphasis was placed heavily on long-range reconnaissance, utilizing tiny patrol units consisting of merely 4 to 6 highly trained men. These isolated teams were inserted deep behind enemy lines for extended durations. Their primary tactical objective was not to fiercely hold ground or seek decisive firefights. Instead, their crucial mission was to silently gather vital intelligence, carefully map enemy logistics routes, and initiate contact only when they held an absolute, overwhelming tactical advantage. This strategy demanded a completely different set of physical tools and survival skills. To execute these silent intelligence-gathering missions, Australian soldiers obsessively stripped down their combat webbing to the absolute bare minimum. If a specific item was not strictly essential for immediate survival or the execution of the mission, it was brutally discarded back at the base camp. They calculated that excess weight generated unwanted noise and accelerated physical exhaustion, both of which severely compromised their required stealth. The lightweight fabric bush hat perfectly embodied this minimalist philosophy. It offered maximum functional utility regarding environmental protection while maintaining the absolute lowest possible sensory profile within the dense, hostile vegetation. This strict adherence to operational stealth dictated an agonizingly slow pace of movement through the unforgiving terrain. A seasoned Australian patrol might painstakingly cover less than a single kilometer during a grueling 4-hour march. They stopped relentlessly to listen, carefully observing the intricate baseline behaviors of the surrounding wildlife. They patiently allowed the disturbed jungle to organically settle back into its natural acoustic rhythm after they cautiously passed through. The ultimate tactical goal was to observe the armed adversary without ever being observed in return. A heavy steel helmet constantly threatened to shatter this fragile illusion of complete invisibility. Furthermore, the Australian military culture possessed a deep-seated tradition of trusting the operational judgment of the individual soldier on the ground. Officers who had personally endured the brutal conditions of Malaya inherently understood that the infantrymen hacking through the bamboo often knew better than the distant logistical planners. If a particular piece of standard equipment failed in the field, it was quickly modified or entirely abandoned. The wide-brimmed slouch hat had proven its undisputed worth across multiple tropical deployments over decades. It required no formal institutional defense. It simply worked, and the soldiers actively demanded to wear it. The massive American military machine, numbering over 500,000 personnel at its absolute peak, faced entirely different logistical and administrative constraints. Equipping such a colossal, diverse force required immense standardization across all branches and specialized units. While individual American soldiers were highly adaptable and constantly improvised brilliant localized solutions, official equipment changes faced severe institutional resistance. Modifying standard issue gear across an army of that incredible magnitude involved complex supply chains and rigid bureaucratic protocols. Consequently, the frontline troops were often permanently locked into utilizing equipment engineered for a completely different theater of conventional warfare. Despite these stark operational differences, the Allied forces frequently worked in close proximity, constantly observing each other's distinct methodologies. American advisors who closely embedded with Australian units were consistently struck by their allies' eerie comfort within the hostile environment. They noted how the Australians moved differently, sounded completely different, and approached the brutal terrain with a quiet, lethal patience. The Australians seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to effortlessly read the jungle landscape. This was not magic. It was the direct, calculated result of specialized training, historical experience, and equipment specifically tailored for the immediate environment. This continuous interaction fostered a deep, mutual professional respect between the diverse Allied formations. The Australians deeply admired the incredible courage of the American infantry and deeply relied upon their unprecedented ability to rapidly summon overwhelming aerial and artillery support when localized situations violently deteriorated. Simultaneously, the Americans highly respected the Australians' unmatched fieldcraft and their uncanny ability to quietly navigate the deadliest terrain on Earth. The bush hat slowly became a recognized, respected symbol of this specialized expertise. American troops would occasionally trade their heavy gear for the distinctive Australian headwear when strict base regulations temporarily permitted. Ultimately, the visible contrast between the heavy steel pot and the lightweight fabric brim was the physical manifestation of two completely different wars being fought simultaneously. The Americans waged a massive, industrialized campaign of immense attrition, relying heavily on modern technology and sheer explosive volume to aggressively break the enemy's logistical spine. The Australians waged a silent, intimate campaign of calculated intelligence, relying primarily on human endurance and strict environmental integration. Both Allied doctrines possessed inherent, unavoidable flaws, but within the suffocating green claustrophobia of the deep bush, the quiet approach often mitigated the most immediate, lethal friction. In the deep bush, the loudest alarm wasn't a siren. It was the sudden, terrifying cessation of insect noise. To hear that silence, a soldier had to become part of it. This was the ultimate climax of Australian jungle doctrine, a brutal test of psychological endurance rather than raw firepower. A 5-man SASR patrol had seamlessly merged into a dense bamboo thicket alongside a suspected enemy transit trail. They were not there to fight a massive battle. They were there to silently observe, meticulously count, and effectively vanish without leaving a single trace of their presence behind. This operation demanded an agonizing level of physical discipline that defied basic human instinct. For 18 excruciating hours, these 5 men remained absolutely motionless in the suffocating tropical heat. Their muscles cramped painfully, screaming for the slightest adjustment, but movement meant immediate compromise. Swarms of aggressive fire ants and relentless mosquitoes crawled freely over their exposed skin and heavily camouflaged faces. Swatting an insect was a fatal luxury they could not afford. They breathed in shallow, controlled intervals, purposefully synchronizing their own respiration with the rhythmic swaying of the tall bamboo stalks surrounding their hidden position. Every piece of their carefully curated equipment was thoroughly tested by this profound stillness. The Australian fabric bush hat proved its ultimate tactical worth during these long, agonizing hours of forced immobility. Unlike a heavy steel helmet, which would relentlessly press into the skull and cause blinding neck spasms over time, the soft fabric rested weightlessly. The wide brim effectively broke the unnatural roundness of their heads, completely masking their human silhouettes within the intricate shadows. Furthermore, It silently absorbed the profuse sweat that would have otherwise dripped painfully into their unblinking, wide-open eyes. As the suffocating afternoon transitioned into a pitch-black canopy night, the true psychological friction of the jungle intensified. The environment was an overwhelming sensory assault of constant noise. Cicadas buzzed with deafening intensity, frogs croaked loudly from hidden puddles, and small nocturnal predators rustled violently through the decaying leaf litter. To an untrained ear, it was a chaotic wall of sound. But to the seasoned Australian patrol, this continuous biological symphony was their vital security blanket. As long as the jungle remained incredibly loud, they knew with absolute certainty that they were completely alone and secure. The patrol commander, a hardened veteran of Malaya, communicated with his men entirely through imperceptible physical touches. A single squeeze on a shoulder meant absolute freezing. 2 gentle taps meant slow visual scanning. Breathe through your mouth, keep your jaw slack, he had quietly instructed them before the insertion, his voice barely a breath. A clenched jaw amplified internal pulse sounds, masking external auditory cues. Their soft fabric hats allowed their ears to remain completely unobstructed, precisely capturing every subtle frequency change in the surrounding environment. Their survival depended entirely on this unfiltered acoustic clarity. Around 2 in the morning, the atmospheric pressure subtly shifted, and the agonizing friction of impending contact began. It did not start with the dramatic crunch of a boot or the metallic clatter of a rifle sling. It began with a localized, creeping wave of absolute silence. The deafening cicadas abruptly stopped their erratic chirping. The frogs went entirely mute. The surrounding birds ceased their nocturnal shifting. The sudden absence of biological noise hit the Australian soldiers with the physical force of a physical blow. The jungle itself was loudly signaling that an apex predator was approaching. The 5 soldiers instinctively tightened their grips on their heavily taped weapons, ensuring not a single metallic component could rattle. Their soft hats allowed them to smoothly pivot their heads millimeters at a time without scraping against the surrounding bamboo stalks. Had they been wearing heavy American steel helmets, the resulting friction against the rigid vegetation would have instantly sounded an unnatural alarm. Instead, they remained perfectly silent, utilizing the flexible canvas brims to slightly cup the ambient air, effectively funneling the faintest horizontal sounds directly toward their highly trained, waiting ears in the dark. Slowly, the terrifying source of the sudden silence materialized from the oppressive darkness. It was a heavily armed enemy supply column, moving with disciplined stealth down the narrow, muddy trail. The Australian soldiers could acutely smell the distinct odor of damp cotton, stale sweat, and heavily oiled weapons before they could physically see the approaching combatants. The distance between the concealed patrol and the passing column rapidly closed. 10 meters, then 5 meters. The incredible tension within the hidden bamboo thicket became a tangible, suffocating weight pressing down upon the unmoving men. This was the exact critical moment where differing military doctrines faced the ultimate, unforgiving test of combat reality. A heavily armored American infantry squad would have likely initiated a devastating ambush right then, instantly transforming the dark jungle into a chaotic slaughterhouse of automatic fire and fragmentation grenades. But the Australian SASR team was not there to initiate a massive firefight against an unknown numerical force. Their explicit operational objective was raw intelligence. They needed to count the enemy soldiers, identify their carried weapons, and note the specific direction of their nocturnal logistical movement. The enemy column marched incredibly close, completely unaware of the lethal presence hidden just inches away in the brush. An enemy point man, scanning the thick undergrowth, walked within a mere 2 meters of the Australian commander's concealed position. The commander did not flinch, his face perfectly broken up by the dark, irregular shadow cast by his slouched bush hat. A steel helmet, even heavily camouflaged, might have caught a stray glint of minimal moonlight or presented an unnatural, perfectly geometric dome against the chaotic flora. The soft fabric simply vanished into the natural background. For 20 agonizing minutes, the enemy troops continued to quietly filter past the hidden Australian position. The physical discipline required by the hidden patrol was absolutely staggering. A single, uncontrollable cough, an accidental scrape of a combat boot, or the dull, metallic, hollow clink of a shifting steel helmet would have meant instant, point-blank annihilation for the outnumbered five-man team. They were entirely stripped of heavy ballistic protection, relying completely on their absolute invisibility. Their soft headgear absorbed their heavy sweat and completely muffled their subtle head movements as they visually tracked the passing targets. The sheer proximity of the passing enemy forces created an overwhelming, silent friction. The Australian soldiers could literally hear the ragged breathing of their adversaries and the soft squelch of their rubber sandals sinking into the wet mud. The physical urge to violently break the unbearable tension with sudden gunfire was almost biologically overwhelming. Hold the line, let them fade entirely. The commander mentally projected to his squad, his hand resting reassuringly on his radio operator's shoulder. They remained perfectly integrated into the dark landscape, functioning purely as silent, observant extensions of the jungle itself. Finally, the last heavily laden enemy porter quietly vanished down the winding trail, swallowed entirely by the dense tropical undergrowth. However, the Australian patrol did not immediately relax their rigid, cramped muscles. They understood the brutal reality of jungle warfare too well. The enemy frequently employed trailing rear guards to violently eliminate over-eager ambushers. For another grueling 2 hours, the five men remained locked in their agonizing, frozen postures. They waited patiently for the jungle to give them the ultimate all-clear signal. They waited for the surrounding environment to effectively return to its normal state. Slowly, the natural biological symphony of the jungle hesitantly resumed its chaotic rhythm. A single brave tree frog offered a tentative croak from a nearby muddy puddle. A few minutes later, the deafening cicadas gradually spun back up to their intense, vibrating crescendo. The terrifying wave of silence had fully passed, completely replaced by the chaotic, comforting noise of the untouched wilderness. The commander finally exhaled slowly, allowing his rigid shoulders to drop just a fraction of an inch. "Pencil and pad." Quietly, he whispered softly to his radioman, officially ending their 18-hour paralysis. They had successfully observed a major enemy logistical movement without firing a single weapon or taking a single casualty. They had survived an incredibly close-quarters encounter not by deploying overwhelming explosive firepower, but by completely submitting to the strict rules of the environment. Their specialized equipment had performed exactly as intended. The lightweight fabric bush hats had kept them perfectly camouflaged, completely silent, and highly attuned to the critical auditory shifts that had ultimately saved their lives. They had successfully weaponized their own invisibility, proving that extreme stealth was incredibly powerful armor. This 18-hour operation represented the absolute pinnacle of Australian combat fieldcraft during the Vietnam conflict. It was a grueling, unglamorous reality of warfare that lacked any cinematic explosions or heroic, sweeping charges. It was simply 5 exhausted men enduring tremendous physical pain and psychological terror, holding their breath in the suffocating darkness while the enemy walked right past their faces. Their ultimate victory was defined solely by the profound fact that absolutely nothing violent happened. They gathered crucial intelligence and smoothly extracted without leaving so much as a broken twig or a metallic scrape behind. The stark contrast with standard conventional tactics was undeniable in these tense, intimate moments of extreme proximity. Had they been burdened with heavy steel helmets and bulky combat webbing, maintaining that level of perfect immobility for 18 hours would have been biologically impossible. The heavy gear would have inevitably created deadly noise, and the resulting friction would have instantly triggered a chaotic, bloody firefight. By deliberately trading heavy ballistic protection for absolute stealth, they had gained the ultimate tactical advantage, the agonizing, beautiful privilege of dictating exactly when and where the violence would actually begin. As the morning sun finally began to penetrate the thick green canopy, the patrol slowly and painfully extracted themselves from the tangled bamboo. Their limbs were violently shaking from the extreme lactic acid buildup and severe dehydration. Their faces were swollen from hundreds of untreated insect bites. Yet, their fabric bush hats remained firmly in place, silently absorbing the fresh morning sweat. They began the long, agonizingly slow trek back to their extraction coordinates, moving with the same deliberate, silent caution that had kept them alive through the terrifyingly quiet hours of the dark night. This silent victory perfectly validated the deeply ingrained Australian doctrine of minimal footprint and maximum situational awareness. The jungle was a brutally honest judge of military equipment, ruthlessly punishing anything loud, heavy, or unnatural. The soft fabric hat was not merely a cultural fashion statement or a nostalgic nod to past colonial conflicts. It was a highly calculated piece of survival technology, perfectly adapted to an environment where a dropped piece of metal sounded like an artillery strike, and blending into the shadows was the only reliable way to outlast a vastly numerically superior enemy force. In the grand strategic scope of the massive Vietnam War, this tiny, silent patrol was a mere historical footnote. It did not capture territory or permanently destroy massive enemy formations. However, it perfectly illustrated the profound friction of jungle combat and the desperate measures required to overcome it. The Australian soldiers understood that they could never physically conquer the surrounding rainforest with blunt force. Instead, they adapted their tactics and their specialized gear to quietly survive within it. They simply became ghosts, wearing soft canvas crowns, silently observing the mechanical machinery of modern war. The fabric brim offered zero ballistic protection against mortar shrapnel, a brutal arithmetic proven at Long Ten. The bush hat didn't make the soldier invincible. It merely bought them the agonizing privilege of choosing when the violence would begin. The philosophy of absolute stealth carried a terrifying vulnerability that superior fieldcraft could never fully mitigate. When the carefully constructed illusion of invisibility shattered, the physical reality of combat was horrifyingly unforgiving. The troops operated on a razor-thin margin of error where surviving dictated completely avoiding sustained, heavy firefights entirely. This devastating reality was violently demonstrated in August of 1966 within the sprawling, rain-soaked rubber plantations surrounding Long Tan. An Australian infantry company was suddenly engaged by a vastly numerically superior enemy force utilizing heavy weapons. The meticulously calculated advantage of silent movement instantly evaporated amidst the deafening roar of relentless automatic weapons and heavy artillery. They were pinned down in the driving monsoon rain, desperately fighting a conventional, static defensive battle. In this brutal environment, the lightweight canvas headgear provided absolutely no physiological comfort or tactical superiority. As enemy mortar rounds mercilessly pounded the hastily established defensive perimeter, the terrible cost of prioritizing stealth over thick armor became tragically apparent. Jagged metal shrapnel tore through the fragile rubber trees and rained down upon the pinned Australian soldiers. The soft canvas hats, which had brilliantly facilitated their quiet movements through the dense brush, offered zero resistance against the jagged, supersonic iron fragments. Several fatal casualties sustained during the frantic battle were the direct result of catastrophic head trauma that a standard steel helmet might have effectively deflected. American soldiers, who frequently endured similar horrific bombardments, intimately understood the life-saving value of their heavy steel pots during these terrifying, static engagements. A heavy helmet was specifically designed to absorb exactly this type of violent, indirect punishment, significantly increasing the statistical probability of surviving a catastrophic explosion. For the American infantryman, enduring the agonizing neck fatigue and the constant metallic rattling during long patrols was considered an acceptable premium to pay for that brief, crucial moment of ballistic salvation when the jungle abruptly exploded into a chaotic storm of flying steel. Yet, even amidst the horrific carnage and mounting casualties at Long Tan, the ingrained Australian discipline did not fracture under the overwhelming pressure. The soldiers utilized their superior small unit cohesion, masterful fire discipline, and innate understanding of the local terrain to stubbornly hold the defensive line. They effectively coordinated devastating artillery support from their distant base, slowly breaking the massive enemy assault. The bush hat had absolutely not caused this desperate battle to occur, and a heavy steel helmet would certainly not have magically prevented the massive, coordinated enemy ambush. The brutal arithmetic of jungle combat strictly dictated that every tactical choice carried an inherent, unavoidable physical penalty. The heavy American helmet aggressively protected against unpredictable ballistic fragments, but directly increased the dangerous likelihood of initial detection and subsequent ambushes. The lightweight Australian hat significantly decreased the probability of unwanted discovery but left the exposed soldier incredibly vulnerable when heavy combat was inevitably forced upon them. Neither specific approach was inherently flawed. They simply represented two completely different mathematical calculations attempting to solve the exact same terrifying equation of human survival. This harsh reality fostered a unique, unspoken mutual respect between the diverse Allied formations operating within the same hostile environment. American combat veterans who observed Australian units deeply admired their unbelievable noise discipline and their terrifying ability to seamlessly merge into the dark jungle backdrop. They openly recognized that the Australian troops required immense physical restraint and extraordinary psychological fortitude to walk into the deep bush wearing nothing but soft canvas on their heads. It was a level of raw, calculated vulnerability that many heavily armored American troops found deeply unsettling. Conversely, the Australian soldiers harbored a profound respect for the sheer, unadulterated firepower and immense logistical courage of the American military machine. When isolated Australian patrols occasionally found themselves severely pinned down and heavily outgunned, it was frequently American close air support and massive artillery batteries that provided the decisive, life-saving intervention. They fully understood that the American doctrine of overwhelming force possessed a terrifying effectiveness that small, silent patrols could never replicate. The two radically different military philosophies effectively complemented each other, creating a complex, multi-layered Allied combat strategy. In the sprawling, chaotic base camps, this mutual professional respect often materialized through the quiet exchange of standard tactical equipment. American infantrymen would frequently trade valuable rations or essential supplies just to acquire a genuine Australian bush hat. To the American soldier, possessing the distinctive slouch hat was a unique badge of honor, representing a tangible connection to the legendary silent jungle trackers. For the Australians, these casual trades represented a quiet, proud acknowledgement that their specialized, grueling methodology was highly valued by the most powerful industrial military force on Earth. Decades after the helicopters finally departed and the dense jungle reclaimed the scarred battlefields, military historians continued to fiercely debate the actual efficacy of these contrasting combat doctrines. The American military establishment spent years meticulously analyzing their massive tropical deployment, eventually adopting more flexible, lightweight equipment standards for their specialized modern infantry units. They learned hard lessons regarding the extreme limitations of heavy conventional armor in deeply restrictive, hostile terrain. The agonizing friction experienced in Southeast Asia fundamentally reshaped how future generations of American soldiers would be equipped for irregular warfare. For the Australian military forces, the bloody conflict in Vietnam thoroughly validated their historic, deeply ingrained operational philosophy regarding stealth and deliberate environmental adaptation. The wide-brimmed bush hat remained a permanent, iconic fixture of their standard combat uniform, proudly connecting modern special operators to the silent, lethal ghosts who previously stalked the humid rubber plantations of Phuoc Tuy. It stands as a timeless, woven testament to a military culture that explicitly believes the absolute best defense in a hostile environment is a profound, respectful understanding of the unforgiving terrain itself. Ultimately, the fascinating dichotomy between the heavy steel dome and the soft canvas brim perfectly encapsulates the profound tragedy and complexity of jungle warfare. War is never cleanly resolved by simply adopting a single piece of superior equipment or rigidly enforcing a flawless tactical doctrine. It is an endless series of agonizing, lethal compromises explicitly paid for with human blood. The bush hat didn't make the Australian soldier invincible. It simply bought them the agonizing privilege of choosing when the violence would begin, demanding a heavy price when the silence finally broke. Two highly capable Allied armies walked bravely into the exact same suffocating green nightmare, bringing completely different tools to solve the exact same terrifying problem. One force chose to aggressively confront the lethal friction by utilizing heavy, protective steel, while the other force chose to silently absorb that exact same friction by wearing light, adaptive fabric. Both methods produced extraordinary heroism and devastating tragedy in equal measure. In the brutal, unforgiving depths of the tropical rainforest, there was no perfect armor, only the unwavering, gritty resilience of the men underneath it.